The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge William Harrison, a man in his late 50s with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, sat behind his imposing desk, his black robe pressed and perfect as always. The clock on the wall showed 9:15 a.m., and already the room was filled with nervous energy from the 23 people waiting for their traffic cases to be heard. Sarah Thompson sat in the third row, her dark blue business suit setting her apart from the casual attire of other defendants. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had built something from nothing. Her successful chain of organic grocery stores employed over 100 people across the city, though none of that would matter in traffic court. She checked her watch again, her fingers lightly tapping the leather briefcase on her lap. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the room, the Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding. The shuffle of feet and rustle of clothing filled the air as everyone stood. Judge Harrison nodded briefly, his face maintaining its usual stern expression. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm. A young college student stammered through an explanation for his speeding ticket. An elderly man argued about a parking violation. A middle-aged woman cried while describing how she couldn't afford her fine. Through it all, Judge Harrison maintained his reputation for being strict but fair, though his fare often leaned heavily towards strict. Sarah watched each case carefully, noting how the judge's patience seemed to wear thinner with each passing hour. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, barely masking the nervous whispers of those still waiting. A young intern rushed in with a stack of papers, nearly tripping over her own feet, earning a sharp look from the judge that made her face flush red. Officer Mike Reynolds, a veteran traffic cop known for his detailed reports, stood at attention near the prosecutor's table. He had been presenting evidence all morning, his blue uniform crisp despite the late August heat. Every now and then, he would sip water from a paper cup, his eyes constantly scanning the room out of habit. The court clerk, Mrs. Jenkins, a woman who had served in this courtroom longer than Judge Harrison himself, efficiently moved through the docket. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and her fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced precision. She had seen thousands of cases, but something about Sarah Thompson made her pause briefly when reviewing the file. As the morning wore on, the wooden benches grew increasingly uncomfortable. A baby started crying in the back, and its mother quickly rushed out, drawing another disapproving glance from Judge Harrison. The judge's reputation for running a tight ship was well known throughout Springfield County. Local attorneys often joked that even the clock ran faster when Harrison demanded it. Sarah noticed small details others might miss. The way Judge Harrison's left hand would tap his desk 3 times before announcing each fine. How he never looked directly at defendants when they first approached, but always studied their reactions after pronouncing judgment. The slight tilt of his head when something caught his interest. The bailiff, Officer Marcus Chen, maintained his position by the judge's bench, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. He had worked with Judge Harrison for 8 years and could almost predict when the judge would call for order, his hand moving toward his gavel just seconds before it was needed. Outside the tall windows, life in Springfield continued as usual. Cars honked in the distance, and the massive oak tree in the courthouse yard cast shifting shadows across the room. A construction project across the street added occasional muffled booms to the courtroom's atmosphere, making some defendants jump in their seats. As the clock approached noon, Sarah felt her case drawing nearer. She reviewed her documentation one last time, though she had memorized every detail. Her traffic violation seemed minor in comparison to some she witnessed that morning, but she knew better than to assume anything in Judge Harrison's courtroom. Years of business experience had taught her that preparation was everything, yet something in the judge's demeanor suggested this might be one of those times when preparation alone wouldn't be enough. The air in the courtroom grew heavier with anticipation as Mrs. Jenkins shuffled her papers, preparing to call the next case. Sarah straightened her spine, adjusted her collar, and took a deep breath. Years of managing business crises had trained her to remain calm under pressure, but something about this morning felt different. Perhaps it was the way Judge Harrison's gavel seemed to fall with increasing force as the morning progressed, or maybe it was the subtle changes in his tone that she'd noticed with each passing case. Case number 247, Sarah Thompson, Mrs. Jenkins called out, her voice clear and professional in the quiet courtroom. Sarah stood up smoothly, gathering her briefcase and documents with practiced ease. As she walked toward the front, several heads turned to watch her. Her presence commanded attention without trying. Judge Harrison was still writing notes about the previous case, his pen scratching against paper. He didn't look up as Sarah took her position behind the defendant's podium. Officer Reynolds moved forward, holding his citation book and preparing to present his evidence. "Miss Thompson," Judge Harrison began, still focused on his papers, "you are charged with failing to stop at a traffic signal that had turned red. How do you plead?" His tone carried the same weightiness he had used all morning, a voice that had pronounced thousands of judgments over his career. Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her voice was steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the courtroom. For the first time, Judge Harrison glanced up, his eyes meeting hers briefly before moving to the citation in front of him. Officer Reynolds stepped forward. "Your Honor, on July 15th at approximately 8:45 a.m., I observed Ms. Thompson's vehicle, a black Mercedes SUV, entering the intersection of Main and Oak Streets as the light turned red. The weather was clear, visibility was excellent, and there were no obstructions to the traffic signals." The judge nodded, making another note. The morning sun had shifted, and now it cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression even more severe. Sarah noticed how his left hand tapped the desk 3 times, the same pattern she had observed earlier. "Miss Thompson," Judge Harrison said, "do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah opened her briefcase and removed a single sheet of paper. "Yes, Your Honor. I have dashcam footage from my vehicle showing that the light was yellow when I entered the intersection. Additionally, there was a delivery truck close behind my vehicle, and I determined it would have been more dangerous to attempt a sudden stop." This caught Judge Harrison's attention. Most defendants came with excuses. Few came with evidence. He looked up properly for the first time, studying Sarah's face. She met his gaze steadily, her expression professional and composed. "Officer Reynolds," the judge turned to the police officer, "did you observe a delivery truck behind Ms. Thompson's vehicle?" Officer Reynolds shifted slightly. "I was positioned at the corner, Your Honor. My focus was on vehicles crossing the intersection. I can't confirm or deny the presence of a truck behind her vehicle." The courtroom had grown quieter than usual. The regular audience of waiting defendants, used to quick guilty pleas and rapid-fire fines, sensed something different about this case. Even Mrs. Jenkins had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Sarah continued, her voice maintaining its professional tone. "I have been driving for 24 years, Your Honor, with no previous traffic violations. I own several businesses in this community and understand the importance of traffic safety. My decision at that moment was based on what I believed would prevent an accident." Judge Harrison's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers had stopped their usual tapping. He studied the dashcam footage printout Sarah had submitted, then looked at Officer Reynolds' citation again. The air conditioning clicked on, adding a soft hum to the tense silence. "Miss Thompson," Judge Harrison began, his tone carrying a note of skepticism that hadn't been there before. "While I appreciate your detailed explanation, the fact remains that Officer Reynolds, a trained professional with 15 years of experience, observed your vehicle entering the intersection after the light had turned red." Sarah's posture remained perfect, but those watching closely might have noticed her grip tighten slightly on the podium. The morning light now illuminated her face, highlighting the dignity in her expression as she prepared to respond to the judge's skepticism. The bailiff shifted his weight, years of experience telling him this case wouldn't be as straightforward as the others. Through the windows, the sounds of construction had paused, as if even the outside world was waiting to hear what would happen next in courtroom 7B. Judge Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving between the citation and Sarah's evidence. The usual swift efficiency of his courtroom had given way to something else, a moment of genuine consideration that seemed to surprise even him. The next few minutes would prove crucial, not just for Sarah's case, but for something neither of them yet understood. Judge Harrison straightened in his chair, his expression hardening into the one his regular courtroom visitors knew all too well. The morning had stretched into early afternoon, and the sunlight now fell directly across his desk, highlighting the polished nameplate that read, "Honorable William Harrison." "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice carrying that particular tone that made experienced lawyers brace themselves. "While I appreciate your detailed presentation and your clean driving record, this court must maintain strict standards regarding traffic signals." Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. The only sign of tension was a slight tightening around her eyes. Behind her, the remaining defendants in the courtroom leaned forward, sensing they were watching something unusual unfold. "Your Honor," Sarah spoke carefully, "I have brought video evidence, which shows, at best, a debatable situation." Judge Harrison interrupted, something he rarely did. "The law is clear about yellow lights, Ms. Thompson. They mean prepared to stop, not speed up to beat the red." Mrs. Jenkins, the court clerk, glanced up from her computer screen, her fingers pulsing over the keyboard. In 15 years, she had developed an instinct for significant moments in court, and something about this exchange made her pay extra attention. "The fine will be $400, Judge Harrison continued, his gavel ready in his hand, "plus court costs of $85. The amount was at the higher end of the typical range, even for this courtroom. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Officer Reynolds, still standing at his spot, shifted uncomfortably. Even he seemed surprised by the severity of the fine, given the circumstances and Sarah's evidence. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not anger or frustration, but a deep disappointment that seemed to go beyond the fine itself. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her checkbook, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quietness, "I respect this court's decision. However, I want the record to show that I presented evidence that was not fully considered." She paused, then added, "Sometimes, what seems clear at first glance deserves a second look." Judge Harrison's hand tightened slightly on his gavel. Something about her words, or perhaps the way she said them, made him look at her properly for the first time. He noticed details he had missed before, her perfectly pressed suit, the subtle pearl necklace, the way she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. "Miss Thompson, are you suggesting this court has not given your case proper consideration?" His tone carried a warning that would have made most defendants backtrack quickly. But Sarah remained steady. "No, Your Honor, I'm suggesting that justice, like safety, sometimes requires us to look beyond our first impressions." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and quiet whispers had ceased. The bailiff, Officer Chen, found himself holding his breath, something about this exchange feeling more important than the usual traffic court proceedings. Judge Harrison's face flushed slightly. He raised his gavel, then paused, an unusual hesitation for him. "This court's decision stands, Miss Thompson. Pay the fine with the clerk. Next case." The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed louder than usual in the hushed courtroom. Sarah nodded once, turned, and walked to Mrs. Jenkins's desk. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor, the sound emphasizing the continuing silence. As she wrote the check, her hands were steady. Mrs. Jenkins noticed that Sarah's signature was clear and precise, not the angry scrawl she usually saw from fine defendants. When Sarah turned to leave, she walked with the same dignity she had shown throughout the proceedings. Judge Harrison had already called the next case, but his eyes followed Sarah's exit. Something about her composure bothered him in a way he couldn't quite identify. He had seen thousands of defendants, handed out countless fines, but this one felt different. As Sarah reached the courtroom doors, the afternoon sun caught her figure, creating a brief silhouette. For a moment, she paused, her hand on the door handle. Without turning back, she pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind a courtroom that felt somehow changed by her presence. Judge Harrison forced his attention back to the next case, but his usual rhythm felt off. His left hand had stopped its habitual tapping, and the weight of his robe seemed heavier than usual. The afternoon session was just beginning, but something had shifted in courtroom 7B, though none of them yet knew exactly what. Later that evening, Judge William Harrison sat in his private study at home, surrounded by campaign finance documents. The day's court sessions were over, but something about his last interaction with Sarah Thompson kept nagging at him. The study's warm oak paneling and soft lamplight usually helped him relax, but not tonight. Linda Martinez, his campaign manager of 6 years, had arranged this evening meeting to review donor lists for his upcoming re-election campaign. She sat across from him, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she sorted through papers with practiced efficiency. "William, you'll be happy to know we've had a strong quarter," Linda said, pulling out a particularly thick folder. "Several of our long-term supporters have increased their contributions." She began spreading documents across his mahogany desk, creating neat piles of donor information. The judge nodded absently, his mind still partially in the courtroom. The ceiling fan spun lazily above them, creating a gentle breeze that rustled the papers. Outside, the streetlights had just come on, casting long shadows through the study's windows. "Here's our list of top donors from the past 5 years," Linda continued, sliding a paper toward him. "These are the people we really need to focus on for the upcoming fundraiser next month." Judge Harrison picked up the list, more out of habit than interest. His eyes moved down the column of names, not really reading them until he stopped. His hand froze mid-page turn. "Linda," his voice came out rougher than usual, "is this correct?" He pointed to a name near the top of the list. "Sarah Thompson, $25,000. Linda leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. "Oh yes, Sarah Thompson. She's been one of our most consistent supporters. Not just monetary contributions. She's hosted 3 fundraising events at her home in the past 2 years. Her organic grocery chain has been instrumental in catering our campaign functions at cost." The judge's face paled slightly. He loosened his tie, suddenly feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. "Tell me more about her," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sarah Thompson?" Linda brightened, pulling out another file. "She's quite remarkable, actually. Started her business from scratch 15 years ago. Now owns 6 organic grocery stores across the county. She's on the Chamber of Commerce board, runs a scholarship program for underprivileged students, and..." Linda paused, looking at the judge's increasingly distressed expression. "William, is everything all right?" Judge Harrison stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The evening traffic moved below, car lights creating streams of red and white in the darkness. "I had her in my courtroom today," he said quietly. "Oh." Linda's voice carried a note of curiosity. "What for?" "A traffic violation." He turned back to face Linda, his expression troubled. "I fined her heavily. I didn't give her evidence the consideration it deserved." Linda's eyebrows rose. She'd known William Harrison for years, had seen him handle countless campaign challenges, but she'd never seen him look quite so disturbed. "She tried to show me dashcam footage," he continued, more to himself than to Linda. "She was professional, prepared, respectful." His voice trailed off as he remembered Sarah's words about second looks and first impressions. The silence in the study grew heavy. Linda watched as the usually composed judge picked up Sarah's donor file again, this time reading it carefully. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "She's dedicated over 50% of her profits to community development programs," he read aloud. "Established a food bank partnership, created job opportunities for former inmates." Each new detail felt like a weight on his conscience. Linda cleared her throat softly. "William, we all make quick judgments sometimes. It's part of being human." But Judge Harrison wasn't listening. He was remembering Sarah's face in the courtroom, the dignity in her bearing, the careful way she had chosen her words. He thought about his dismissive tone, his quick judgment, his refusal to properly review her evidence. The study's grandfather clock chimed 9 times, its deep tones echoing in the quiet room. Judge Harrison sat heavily in his leather chair, the donor list still in his hands. For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, he felt the full weight of what it meant to judge too quickly, to see what you expect to see rather than what's actually there. "Linda," he said finally, his voice carrying a new note of determination, "I need you to clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I have something important I need to address." Sleep didn't come easily to Judge William Harrison that night. He lay in his king-size bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above him. Every turn of the blade seemed to replay moments from the courtroom, now seen through very different eyes. At 3 in the morning, he finally gave up trying to sleep. Still wearing his blue-striped pajamas, he walked downstairs to his study. The house was quiet except for the soft clicking of his slippers against the hardwood floors and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Sitting at his desk, he pulled out his court records from the past month. The leather chair that usually felt so comfortable now seemed to mock him with its privilege. He turned on his desk lamp, its warm glow creating a small circle of light in the darkness. "Let's see what I've really been doing," he mumbled to himself, opening the first file. For the next 2 hours, he went through case after case, making notes about his decisions. A pattern began to emerge that made his stomach tighten. Traffic violations by white drivers from wealthy neighborhoods often receive warnings or minimum fines. Similar violations by drivers from minority communities consistently received higher fines. He hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps he hadn't wanted to notice. The early morning silence was broken by the delivery of his newspaper. He heard it thump against his front door but didn't move to get it. Instead, he opened his laptop and started researching judicial bias. The articles he found made for uncomfortable reading. 20 years, he whispered to himself, running his hands through his gray hair. "I've been on the bench for 20 years, thinking I was being fair." The first light of dawn was starting to creep through his study windows, but he barely noticed. His phone buzzed, a text from Linda, his campaign manager. "Don't forget about the Chamber of Commerce lunch today. Sarah Thompson will be there." The judge's hand shook slightly as he put down his phone. The thought of facing Sarah made his chest tight. He got up and walked to the small bathroom attached to his study, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "What kind of judge have I been?" he asked his reflection. The face looking back at him seemed older than it had just yesterday. Dark circles under his eyes showed his sleepless night, but it was the uncertainty in his expression that really aged him. He thought about his father, also a judge, who had taught him about justice and fairness. What would he think about these patterns in his son's courtroom? The weight of disappointed ancestors seemed to press down on his shoulders. Back at his desk, he pulled up Sarah Thompson's case file again. He read through his notes from yesterday's hearing, cringing at his dismissive tone. The evidence she had tried to present, the dashcam footage he hadn't even looked at, now seemed to accuse him from the pages. His coffee had gone cold, untouched on his desk. Outside, the morning traffic was picking up, the sound of cars reminding him that the world was waking up. In a few hours, he would need to put on his robes again, sit on his bench, and make more decisions that would affect people's lives. But how? He asked the empty room. How do I sit in judgment when I can't trust my own judgment? The judge opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook his wife had given him years ago. On the first clean page, he began to write, "Steps for change." Under it, he listed 1. Review all cases for bias. 2. Seek training on unconscious prejudice. 3. Establish new courtroom procedures. His hand paused over the paper. These were good steps, but they felt inadequate against the weight of 20 years of unexamined biases. The morning sun was now streaming through his study windows, highlighting dust motes in the air. A photo on his wall caught his attention, his swearing-in ceremony from 20 years ago. His younger self smiled confidently at the camera, hand raised, promising to uphold justice equally for all. The contrast between that moment and this one made his chest ache. "First step," he said firmly, straightening in his chair, "is to face what I've done." He picked up his phone to call his clerk. Today's court schedule would need to be cleared. He had more important work to do, starting with a long overdue conversation with Sarah Thompson. The courthouse looked different to Judge Harrison as he walked up its granite steps the next morning. The building he had entered confidently for 2 decades now felt like it held secrets in its shadows. His usual parking spot, marked Chief Judge, seemed like another symbol of the privilege he had never fully examined before. Mrs. Jenkins looked surprised when he walked into his chambers at 7:30 a.m., an hour earlier than usual. "Your Honor," she said, noting his unusually casual attire. He hadn't worn his judicial robes. "I've cleared your morning calendar as requested." "Thank you, Martha," he replied, using her first name for perhaps the first time in years. "Could you help me gather some files? I need every traffic case from the past 6 months." Over the next 2 hours, Judge Harrison and Mrs. Jenkins spread dozens of files across his large conference table. They created separate piles based on the defendant's demographics, fine amounts, and types of violations. The pattern that emerged made Mrs. Jenkins gasp softly. "Your Honor," she whispered, looking at the clearly unequal fine distributions. "I never noticed." "Neither did I, Martha," he said quietly. "Or maybe I didn't want to notice." Around 10 a.m., there was a knock at his chamber door. Linda Martinez, his campaign manager, entered with Dr. James Wilson, a well-known expert on judicial bias from the state university. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," Judge Harrison said, shaking Dr. Wilson's hand. The professor's kind eyes took in the scattered files and charts they created. "This is an unusual request from a sitting judge," Dr. Wilson noted, setting down his briefcase. "Most prefer not to examine their records this closely." Judge Harrison gestured to the evidence before them. "I've spent 20 years thinking I was fair and impartial. Yesterday, I discovered I was wrong." For the next several hours, Dr. Wilson reviewed the cases with them. He explained concepts like implicit bias, systemic racism, and the impact of unconscious prejudice on judicial decisions. The judge took notes furiously, like a first-year law student. "The good news," Dr. Wilson said, "is that awareness is the first step toward change. The fact that you're willing to examine your own decisions is significant." Around lunchtime, Officer Chen, the bailiff, brought in sandwiches. He found them all sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers and statistics. The judge had removed his tie, and his sleeves were rolled up. "Your Honor," Officer Chen said, hesitating at the unusual scene, the Chief Justice called. "He wants to know why you canceled court today." Judge Harrison looked up from a particularly troubling set of statistics. "Tell them I'm conducting an essential judicial review. In fact," he paused, thinking, "tell them I'd like to meet with the Judicial Council next week. We need to discuss implementing new training programs." Linda, who had been quiet most of the morning, spoke up. "William, this could affect your re-election campaign. Some donors might not appreciate this kind of self-examination." The judge stood up, stretching his stiff back. He walked to his window, looking down at the courthouse square below. People were going about their daily business, trusting in the system he was part of. "When I took my oath," he said slowly, "I swore to administer justice fairly, not to win elections or please donors." He turned back to the room. "If examining my biases costs me my seat, then maybe I don't deserve to be a judge." Dr. Wilson smiled approvingly. "Change often comes at a cost, Your Honor, but the cost of not changing is usually higher." Mrs. Jenkins, who had been organizing their morning's findings, held up a fresh sheet of paper. "I drafted some initial recommendations, Your Honor. New procedures for reviewing fine structures, mandatory bias training for all court staff, and a community feedback system." Judge Harrison nodded, taking the paper. His eyes fell on a family entering the courthouse below. A mother and 2 children, their expressions nervous. He wondered how many families like them had faced bias in his courtroom over the years. "This is just the beginning," he said firmly. "We have 20 years of decisions to review, and God knows how many wrongs to right." He picked up his phone, scrolling to a number he had asked Linda for earlier. "But first," he added, "I need to make an important call to Sarah Thompson. Some apologies shouldn't wait." Sarah Thompson sat in her office at the main branch of Nature's Best Organics, reviewing quarterly reports, when her assistant knocked on the door. "Miss Thompson, Judge Harrison is on line 1. He says it's important." Sarah's hand paused over her keyboard. The memory of yesterday's courtroom experience was still fresh in her mind. After a moment's hesitation, she picked up the phone. "This is Sarah Thompson speaking." "Miss Thompson, this is Judge William Harrison." His voice sounded different from the courtroom, less formal, more human. "I wonder if you would be willing to meet with me today. There are some important matters I need to discuss with you." 2 hours later, Sarah walked into Carlton's, a quiet restaurant downtown. The hostess led her to a private corner booth where Judge Harrison waited. He stood as she approached, no longer wearing his judicial robes but a simple gray suit. His face showed signs of a sleepless night. "Miss Thompson, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. A pot of tea and 2 cups sat untouched on the table. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked for this meeting." Sarah settled into her seat, her expression politely neutral. "I admit I'm curious, Your Honor." "Please call me William," he said, pouring tea for both of them. His hands trembled slightly. "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." Sarah wrapped her fingers around the warm teacup but didn't drink. She waited, watching as the judge, the man who had dismissed her so easily yesterday, struggled to find his words. After court yesterday, he continued, I learned about your contributions to my campaign, but that's not why I'm apologizing. He met her eyes directly. I'm apologizing because I was wrong. I let my biases affect my judgment, and I failed to give your case the consideration it deserved. Sarah set her cup down carefully. May I speak frankly, William? He nodded, looking both eager and afraid of what she might say. Yesterday in court wasn't about a traffic ticket, she began. It was about being seen, or rather, not being seen. When you dismissed my evidence without even looking at it, you weren't just dismissing a piece of footage. You were dismissing me as a person. The judge's face flushed, but he didn't look away. You're right. And it wasn't the first time I'd done this. I've spent the morning reviewing my cases, and I found a pattern of bias that shames me deeply. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What do you plan to do about it? For the next hour, Judge Harrison shared his morning's work with her. The case review, Dr. Wilson's consultation, the planned changes to court procedures. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally asking sharp, insightful questions that made him think even deeper. It's a start, she said finally, but the real test will be in the implementation. Change isn't just about new procedures. It's about changing hearts and minds. That's actually why I wanted to meet with you, the judge said. I need help. Your business experience, your community involvement, your perspective, they could be invaluable in reshaping our court's approach to justice. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job, William? I'm asking for your help in making real change, he replied. Would you consider joining a new community advisory board for the court? We need voices like yours, people who will speak truth to power. The afternoon sun streamed through the restaurant's windows, casting warm light across their table. Sarah studied the man across from her, not the stern judge from yesterday, but someone who had faced his flaws and chosen to change. Before I answer, she said, reaching into her bag, I'd like you to look at something. She pulled out the dashcam footage from yesterday's case. This time, really look at it. Judge Harrison took the evidence she hadn't let him see yesterday. As he reviewed it, his face showed the careful consideration it should have received in court. When he finished, he looked up at her with new understanding. You were right about the yellow light, he said quietly, and the truck behind you. Your decision was the safe one. Sarah nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Sometimes, justice is like that dashcam footage, William. We just need to be willing to take a second look. Sarah Thompson sat in her office at the main branch of Nature's Best Organics, reviewing quarterly reports, when her assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Thompson, Judge Harrison is on line 1. He says it's important. Sarah's hand paused over her keyboard. The memory of yesterday's courtroom experience was still fresh in her mind. After a moment's hesitation, she picked up the phone. This is Sarah Thompson speaking. Miss Thompson, this is Judge William Harrison. His voice sounded different from the courtroom, less formal, more human. I wonder if you would be willing to meet with me today. There are some important matters I need to discuss with you. 2 hours later, Sarah walked into Carlton's, a quiet restaurant downtown. The hostess led her to a private corner booth where Judge Harrison waited. He stood as she approached, no longer wearing his judicial robes but a simple gray suit. His face showed signs of a sleepless night. Miss Thompson, thank you for coming, he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. A pot of tea and 2 cups sat untouched on the table. I imagine you're wondering why I asked for this meeting. Sarah settled into her seat, her expression politely neutral. I admit I'm curious, Your Honor. Please call me William, he said, pouring tea for both of them. His hands trembled slightly. I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. Sarah wrapped her fingers around the warm teacup but didn't drink. She waited, watching as the judge, the man who had dismissed her so easily yesterday, struggled to find his words. After court yesterday, he continued, I learned about your contributions to my campaign, but that's not why I'm apologizing. He met her eyes directly. I'm apologizing because I was wrong. I let my biases affect my judgment, and I failed to give your case the consideration it deserved. Sarah set her cup down carefully. May I speak frankly, William? He nodded, looking both eager and afraid of what she might say. Yesterday in court wasn't about a traffic ticket, she began. It was about being seen, or rather, not being seen. When you dismissed my evidence without even looking at it, you weren't just dismissing a piece of footage, you were dismissing me as a person. The judge's face flushed, but he didn't look away. You're right. And it wasn't the first time I'd done this. I've spent the morning reviewing my cases, and I found a pattern of bias that shames me deeply. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What do you plan to do about it? For the next hour, Judge Harrison shared his morning's work with her. The case review, Dr. Wilson's consultation, the planned changes to court procedures. Sarah listened carefully, occasionally asking sharp, insightful questions that made him think even deeper. It's a start, she said finally, but the real test will be in the implementation. Change isn't just about new procedures. It's about changing hearts and minds. That's actually why I wanted to meet with you, the judge said. I need help. Your business experience, your community involvement, your perspective, they could be invaluable in reshaping our court's approach to justice. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job, William? I'm asking for your help in making real change, he replied. Would you consider joining a new community advisory board for the court? We need voices like yours. People who will speak truth to power. The afternoon sun streamed through the restaurant's windows, casting warm light across their table. Sarah studied the man across from her, not the stern judge from yesterday, but someone who had faced his flaws and chosen to change. Before I answer, she said, reaching into her bag, I'd like you to look at something. She pulled out the dashcam footage from yesterday's case. This time, really look at it. Judge Harrison took the evidence she hadn't let him see yesterday. As he reviewed it, his face showed the careful consideration it should have received in court. When he finished, he looked up at her with new understanding. You were right about the yellow light, he said quietly, and the truck behind you. Your decision was the safe one. Sarah nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Sometimes, justice is like that dashcam footage, William. We just need to be willing to take a second look.